Okay, thank you for coming out this morning. I'm very excited about this presentation because there's a lot of new information here, and I think it's pretty exciting. The story of the King family, which Kingsville is named after Colonel King, and it was interesting because I have met new residents to Kingsville that had no idea that Kingsville was named after a guy named King. And so it's kind of interesting to put it out there. For those of us, who have lived here for a long time, I've only been here 20 years, so I'll never be from Kingsville, but we take a lot of our heritage for granted, so it's nice to kind of go back to the beginning and start from scratch like we don't know anything. And so we are talking about mostly just Colonel King, because basically his information is enough to fill up one talk. And it's an interesting story because it's a story of an immigrant about coming to the New World and some of the things that you encounter. And there's a lot of oral history that came with the King family. There's no one definitive document that kind of lets you know a lot of these stories, but there's a lot of oral history. So I've been able to kind of parse out some of that oral history, which is a lot of fun too. So we're just starting with this. This was the Windsor Daily Star at the time, the Windsor Star, and this was an article in the newspaper because it was the 100th anniversary of Colonel King coming to this area. So this page right here is from 1935. I thought it was kind of nice to start from. And it gives the history of the family of the 100th anniversary. So again, we are talking about James S. King. This is before he was a colonel. Little is known about his early life in England, and unfortunately that's because when you try to research a James King in England, it is very, very difficult. And you also get a lot of King James information as well, which also makes it very difficult. But we do know that he was born in London, England in 1805, and he was the oldest of 4 children. I thought that was very interesting that the oldest son or the oldest child would come to the New World. But of his other 3 siblings, one brother did follow him a few years later, but he was the one that came here. Interesting, we're going to get to our first part of the oral history. It is commonly said that King was a graduate of Cambridge University, but now we can look that kind of stuff up. And so I went through all the records, the archives of the records of people attending Cambridge University, not just graduating, but attending, and there's no record of his attendance at Cambridge University. But he was an educated man because later I will read a letter to you where he is described as being a gentleman and a scholar, being the master of 7 languages. So he was educated, just kind of not at Cambridge. The next slide we have here is a Paris Register from 1826, and this is when James King, at the age of 21, married Sarah Nightingale. And she was a widow that had 2 children. Her husband was Leonard Nightingale, and he was a former lieutenant with the militia. Now, Leonard's father was a baronet in Cambridgeshire, so that might be where the Cambridge come from. And that may account for the confusion of Colonel King or King being from Cambridge or being educated in Cambridge. And in fact, there is still a Baron Nightingale to this day in England, outside of Cambridge, Cambridgeshire. Needsworth Estate is the ancestral home of the Nightingales. So we have the family emigrating to Montreal via New York in 1829. So married in 1826, 3 years later, you have King, Sarah, his wife, and the 2 boys coming to the New World. And he came to Montreal, and for several years he was employed as a teacher in Montreal. The red star in this map shows the location of the school, and it was called the Union School. And I won't get too much into it now, but he was also working with the man who started the Union School was a Benjamin Workman. And Benjamin and the Workmans were pretty famous in Toronto and in Montreal. And Benjamin's brother went on to take over the Toronto insane asylum. And he had kind of transformed the insane asylum and kind of made it more humane, because back then it was just a dumping ground. A lot of times it was a dumping ground for criminals as well. So I was talking earlier about, sometimes when you're doing research, you find something interesting and then you fall down that rabbit hole and then you realize, I can't possibly cover all this in one talk. So, but the Workmans, very prestigious, and in later biographies about King, it did talk about, oh, and he knew the workmen's. So it was kind of a prestigious company that he was keeping. So in the fall of 1834, the King family decided to leave Montreal and head west due to the second wave of cholera in Montreal. They had a first wave a few years beforehand, and it was pretty dire, pretty awful. They thought that they had gotten, taken care of it. The second wave came. And so the family decided with Benjamin Workman, you know what, we're going to head west. So they started in Montreal, and they started heading west. Now, when they set out, they were looking to perhaps settle in the Western District, which is kind of Essex-Kent, or even the London District. And I have a great letter of introduction that was given by a local land agent in Montreal so that King could bring this, and then hopefully, it's kind of a reference letter. And I'm going to read it to you because I think it's kind of fun. So it says, "Sir, this will be presented to you by James King, Esquire, who, with his lady and 2 sons, are proceeding to the London or Western districts. Mr. King requires from 1 to 200 acres of land. I would further take leave to remark that in the event of either you or any of your friends possessing lands in those districts, Mr. K would be found a most valuable agent, and I should be most happy if any arrangements could be entered into that would hereupon prove certainly advantageous to all parties concerned. Mr. King is a gentleman and scholar being the master of 7 languages. He and his amiable lady have for several years past conducted a seminary here with great credit to themselves and to the entire satisfaction of a large circle of friends, who deeply regret his determination of leaving this city, and the only consolation we have is the sincere hope that his talent and worth may be duly appreciated in whatever township he may find it to his advantage to pitch his tent. Any information, advice, or civilities you are pleased to confer on my noble friend, James King, Esquire and Lady, will be esteemed as a favor done to me. In the meantime, I have the honor to subscribe myself very truly and faithfully your obedient, humble servant." And this was a general land agent, James Allison. So next time someone asks me for a letter of recommendation, I'm going to use this as a template because I think anyone would get this job. So they decided to head west. And interestingly, they end up settling in Michigan. And at the time, so this is a great map. So this is a new immigrants map of Michigan in 1835. And they were passing these out on the East Coast. Actually, these were produced in New York. And they were foldable, and they were giving them out. Because at the time, Michigan was a territory, and they were looking to bring in lots of people so that they could petition the government into statehood. And so they must have gotten one of these flyers, or for some reason, the Kings plus Benjamin Workman decided to settle in Michigan. So also around this time was what was called the Michigan Fever, that the Michigan Fever had officially began. And it brought on a sudden boom in Michigan's population. So just talking about the land, so I'm thinking that the land was very cheap and you could get a lot of it, so that was really bringing people in. And it was really successful because public lands sales rose from 147,000 acres in 1830 to nearly 500,000 by 1834. But by 1835, so think about, these maps are going around and word of mouth and everything, the $2.2 million realized on the sale of 1.8 million acres in Michigan represented 1/7 of the US national totals. So everyone was flooding, and it was referred to as Michigan Fever. So King was able to purchase 80 acres of land, exactly where the star is, that's Lenawee Township. Oddly enough, the little community of Cambridge. And he purchased 80 acres, and the section that he purchased it was called the Michigan-Toledo Strip. And then he promptly started building a log house. So in November of 1835, James and Sarah had their first child, James Jr. And if we remember, they were married in 1826. So this is 9 years later before they have their first child. It is unknown if she had other pregnancies that did not survive, or other children that were born that did not survive. Now, the interesting thing was our local history always reported that the Kings left Michigan in the winter of 1835. And I always thought it was kind of odd because they just had a newborn baby. Why would you start going in the wintertime to come back to Canada? And I think I may have a credible reason why this happened. The Toledo War from 1835 to 1836. And I'll be honest with you, never heard of it. But in trying to research what was happening in Michigan in the 1830s, I came across this. So the urgency to reach Canadian soil may have been due to what is now known as the Toledo War, which was a boundary dispute between the US state of Ohio and the adjoining territory of Michigan over what is now known as the Toledo Strip. And you'll see it highlighted in red on the map. So Michigan was petitioning for statehood and included the disputed strip of land in their survey. And in that strip of land, because that is the access to the lake, is also where Toledo is. So when Ohio had gotten their statehood, they did not include it in the state, but it was acknowledged as disputed land that both the state and the territory could have access to. But Michigan decided to include it in their map. Ohio wasn't having it. So first Ohio sent 1,500 militiamen up to the border, and they just kind of stayed along the border. And then Michigan, of course, brought their militiamen down. So in the 1830s, you had armed people just milling around. And this went on for about 18 months into 1836. So I imagine that perhaps they just wanted to get away from, the potential of a war happening and bloodshed. I'm also thinking that this happened earlier in the year. People saw this coming, but perhaps because Sarah was pregnant, and this does seem to be the first child she had to thrive, he would not want to have them travel while she's pregnant. So wait until she has the baby, wait about a month or so, and then they settle up and they are heading back to Canada. And in fact, King later wrote that he wanted to get back to British soil. So I think that might be a good reason why he ended up coming back at that specific time frame. So the Kings were able to reach the village of Sandwich, which, as you can see, is in the northwest part of Essex County. And that's when the winter weather stopped their progress to Montreal, because they were heading back to Montreal. Cholera had kind of subsided a bit. They were going back home. They got snowed in, and then they rented a house for Sarah and the three sons, her two sons, and their newborn baby. And King, as quoted in his obituary, not wishing to be idle, went to Gosfield and took a school, which was a log cabin located on a farm near Mill Creek. Mill Creek is the one in the middle of Gosfield, which is now Kingsville. And so he went down there and he was teaching, because that's what he did in Montreal, and he was making some money. So Sarah and the kids stayed in Sandwich, which was a larger community, definitely the largest community in this area, and he came down and he was teaching during the wintertime. So as winter turned into spring, King ended up getting hired to be a clerk for the company steam mill, and the decision was made to just relocate. They liked Gosfield, they were just going to stay here. Now the steam mill is indicated by the X, and actually present day, that's Green Hill Cemetery. So that used to be the steam mill, and that explains why Mill Street, and we'll get into that later, but why Mill Street was kind of named so, because it continued on through, because Mill Street goes through the cemetery now, and that's where the steam mill was. So 1837 was a busy year for the King family. He ended up paying for the first installment of lot number 11 in the 5th concession. So you had to put an installment in on the property, and then you had to show that you were making gains in it, that you had to prove before you got the Crown patent, because they didn't want speculators just gobbling up all the land. So you had to reside on the land and make improvements. So in 1837, he got lot 11 is what was on his petition. I love this map right here because it kind of shows you that he's in the middle of nowhere. This map is from 1834, and you can see that most of the settlement happens along the lake. As we know, especially in the west of Division Line, those were United Empire Loyalists and Butler's Rangers, et cetera, et cetera. But he got something right in the middle. Now, Talbot Road was still kind of there, so it wasn't too off the beaten path. But that's where he started improving land. It was also the year that his second child was born. Helena was born on November 19th in 1837. So he's setting up house. He's got 2 older boys that are helping him out. He's got the 2 kids, and he's starting his property, and then the outbreak of the Upper Canada Rebellion happens. So he just can't catch a break. You're driven out of Montreal because of cholera, and then you go into Michigan, and there's kind of a war happening there, and you settle here, you think this is the place to be, and there is the Upper Canada Rebellion. He still decided to stay, and that's when he joined the 3rd Essex Regiment, and he joined as a lieutenant. So again, with him being a lieutenant in the militia would show also that he was an educated person, and he didn't start low down. He was a commissioned officer. While serving in the militia, he was, quote, present at the well-known engagement on Pelee Island. And after the end of the Upper Canada Rebellion, the militia wasn't needed anymore, so when it was disbanded, he was given the promotion to colonel. So from about 1840 on is when he was referred to as Colonel King. And that's how we refer to him nowadays. This is the Battle of Pelee Island, a little information about the battle that happened. I won't read it out to you, but yes. So we are back to this map because we're talking 1840. Okay, he's done with his military service, so he's back to clearing the land. Then he finds out in 1840 that he was clearing the wrong lot in concession 5. He thought he was given lot 11, but he was actually clearing and making all the improvements on lot 12. And so he stopped all progress. And he ended up writing a petition to see if he could swap out 11 for 12. And it said, one of the reasons was, he had said he was misled by a diagram of the township, which I have since ascertained to be incorrect. So in his petition, he writes, in those 3 years, that he managed to make certain improvement to the extent, so this is 3 years, of enclosing and nearly clearing 15 acres of land, of erecting stables and other outbuildings, and partially building a house, which has already cost me 30 pounds, it being yet unfinished on account of discovering that all these improvements are made on a lot upon which I have no claim. So he stopped what he was doing. But the exchange was granted. But there was some back and forth, and he had to have a couple local JPs sign off that, yes, in fact, this was, these improvements were undertaken, because they were worried that people were going to settle land or look around and see something better they like, and just kind of go over there and start settling that and petitioning later. So it was a bit of back and forth, but he did get the swap that he requested. So we're back to Gosfield, and we're talking about the 1830s here. So as you saw from a previous map, it was sparsely populated, with most of the development being located on the southern part of the township near Lake Erie. Gosfield's first post office was granted in 1831, and it was to a small community of Albertville where the first commercial dock was built. So if we see the green line is Division Street, and then you kind of see it's kind of halfway between Division Street and Mercia Township, which is now Leamington. So that's where the first post office it was. It was not an Albertville post office, it was the Gosfield post office. And Albertville was named after Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband. To transport wood and crops from the west part of Gosfield to Albertville, pardon me, which is where the dock was, the farmers would use a trail known as the Lake Road, which followed the shoreline, which is present-day Heritage Road. So I'm back to this map because it kind of shows the dotted line. You kind of see Talbot Street, and then you see the Lake Road. And these are just basically following the trails left over by Indigenous peoples that were in this area beforehand. And so we bring this map back again so that you can follow along here, because the intersection at the east-west section of the new road, which is present-day Main Street, and Division came to be known as the Crossroads. What happened is between Lot 4 and east is that Lake Road fell into the lake. You could no longer traverse it at all. So Peter Malott, who owned the property on lot 3 and 4, he allowed farmers to just kind of come up the new road. It was kind of already there a little bit because of accessing the steam mill. And then we have the Mill Street. So the new road came over Cross Division Line Road, which was the dividing line between Stewart's farm and Harrington's farm. And then that just became the crossroads. And then there's talks, Madeline Malott talks about that once a week there would be like a farmer's market kind of happening there. It's still all bush, but it just happens to be where east and west meet north and south. So this crossroads is now our Four Corners, which is Main and Division. The crossroads would later be known as also King's Corners, and I'll explain that to you as well. Talking about the farm lots, the farm lot east of Division Line was owned by Richard Harrington. He purchased all that land in 1824, and the farm lot on the west was owned by Andrew Stewart, who inherited it from his father, Charles Stewart, who had the land in 1815. So these were just, a couple properties there, a little bit of improvement, and then not much else was kind of put there. So Colonel King decided, and we do get this idea that he really had a grand vision for his new hometown. And Colonel King concluded that he'd like to settle the crossroads, though surrounded by wood on all sides. So in 1842, the schoolmaster, that's how he was described in the deeds that I was able to look up, he purchased 2 acres on the northwest corner of Division Line and the new road. He purchased that for £7, 10 shillings. And so that is the part that's outlined in red. So the streets, the maps were not, like all those building lots were not there. King Street was not there. That was the lot that he bought in the bush. And you can see the location of his home that he built in 1843. So he came down from 5th Concession, decided to come to this new community that he was trying to get going. And so he built the house on that lot, and it was described as a frame house under 2 stories. So I was able to ascertain that from an 1850 assessment where they describe houses. So in 1844, a schoolhouse was built on the east side of Division Line Road on a lot donated by Richard Harrington. So that's where the green is. So that's the original Kingsville school. Because when he was teaching down along the lake, that was just in an old log cabin. This was like a school intentionally built just for that purpose in 1843. So he proceeded to, and then later on, he proceeded to purchase land, 1845, on the southeast corner. I'll show that later of all his properties has. But that's in 1845, he built a merchant shop where he sold some of the, quote, some of the articles necessary for pioneer farming. So he was, building the school, he had the merchant shop there, he had the first house in Kingsville. He's really trying to bring people together and really make this a spot on the map. And he did, because we have, all right, we'll get to the next one, where we have, this is the original plan, the concept of the town of Kingsville as encouraged by Colonel King. So first what he did in the late 1840s was that Andrew Stewart owned the property on the west. And so he encouraged him to map this all out, because he already kind of owned land at the Four Corners. And then, about a year later or so, he was able to convince Harrington to likewise also develop this. So they had like a town center, they had these building lots, because up until then, all the lots were 200 acres. And so, and I wonder if perhaps the reason why he wanted to have one of these plans that had very specific building lots and specific markers was because of what happened when he was settling lot 11 and the map was wrong and he was in the wrong space of time. So that might have been a reason why he was very diligent about having these smaller lots. So each of these lots are 1 chain by 2 chains, and a chain is 66 feet, so 66 feet wide by 132 deep. So those are proper residential building lots. And then a little bit thinner up on the main street, because those were definitely going to be commercial buildings. So this is what he had envisioned for the town of Kingsville. So when the matter of naming the town came up, Mr. Stewart, the original one on the west-hand side of Division, Mr. Stewart, who owned the land first plotted, could easily have had it named after himself. He, however, very properly said that a man who had courage to build a house in the woods and insist on building a town should have it named after him. So that's how it was remarked about how it got the name of Kingsville, because it could have been Stewartville or Harringtonshire, something other, but it became Kingsville. And it is funny that this is taken from the map from 1850, and they were already referring to it as a town. Kingsville actually didn't become a town until 1901, because you have to have a certain amount of population. But they had, big plans for Kingsville. So to get an idea of Colonel King's vision, I wanted to show you a plan for the village of Leamington, and this was 9 years later. So this is what Leamington envisioned when they planned out their municipality in 1859 as compared to Colonel King's vision from 1850. So really encompassed everything, had 4 corners. It was a really sophisticated plan, I think. So in addition to being the first clerk for the township of Gosfield, King also had an office for conveyancing to help with the deeds, mortgages, and other transactions. And over time, he had purchased more land from the original plan. So these are some of the properties that he owned in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s. And still retaining, and we still don't have King Street yet. I will get to that later, but we still don't have King Street. King was not a street, and there's still the original schoolhouse. Okay, so as the community keeps going on, he is a very educated man, so it just came to him that he ended up holding a lot of public offices. So he was the collector of customs, and he was up until a couple years before he died. He was a justice of the peace. He was the clerk for the 3rd Division Court, clerk for the township of Gosfield, superintendent of schools for the township, and the issuer of marriage licenses. This is an example of when he was appointed the superintendent of schools for the township. I like this document because it actually describes this property as being this area, being the United Counties of Essex and Lambton in the province of Canada. So in 1853, which is when he was appointed, that's what this property was referred to as the province of Canada. Now, we were talking about him being a conveyancer for deeds. Something else, this would be an example of one of the fronts of one of his deeds. In carrying out his duties, he would draft legal documents. Actually, you know what? I will go back a little bit. One of those oral histories that have always kind of come down through the decades is the fact that Colonel King was a friend to people that were escaping slavery from the South. And this is something I had seen repeated over and over again, but nothing earlier than like 1950. So I wasn't comfortable in really portraying King like that until I had some hard documents. So I spent a lot of time really looking to see if, because I don't want to whitewash history. I don't want to be an apologist for Colonel King. So I really wanted to get to the root of that. So when I talk about him carrying out his duties as a conveyancer, he drafted legal documents transferring land to people escaping enslavement in the United States and settling in Gosfield. So in this deed right here, this is a deed that he executed in 1870 from Solomon and Ann Weigel to Henry Washington, who had escaped slavery prior to the Civil War, and he settled in this area. And so I got a little bit more information. I'm like, okay, he would have had control. He was doing his job, so, yes, he's doing his job, but I think he had enough influence that if he didn't want a people of color to settle here, he probably could have influenced that. So I needed more information. And I got it. Thankfully, with the help of the Freedom Museum in Amherstburg, I found this book where this passage was found. So this is the front page for the book from 1856, and the book is called The Refugee, Narratives of Fugitive Slaves in Canada. And when they came to Gosfield, this is did it work? Okay. Okay. So in the book, it describes Gosfield, that Gosfield numbers nearly 2,600 inhabitants. The whole colored population by actual count is 78. So I have 2,600 people here, 78 were people of color. Of the heads of families, all but 2 or 3 are freeholders, and some of them have very good farms. Now that's very interesting, because in talking with the people, the curator at the Freedom Museum, she did say that when people of color settled in this area, Harrow, Amherstburg area, a lot of times they were tenanted farmers, and they would give uncultivated property to people of color, give them a 10-year lease, and then when they've improved the property, would not sell it to them and just would kick them off, kind of thing. So it was very interesting that they made special mention that all but 2 or 3 of the heads of the houses were freeholders, so they owned the property that they were working. There's a quote from James King in this book. So James King, Esquire, Clerk of the Courts for the County of Essex, Canada West, thus characterized the colored people of Gosfield, quote, "They are good, loyal subjects and good, honest people. They are as moral as any people. There is not fault to be found with them at all." So it's pretty compelling evidence that he did, believe in this. It could be the fact that, where he was coming from England, where they abolished slavery, right around the time that he was coming over here. It could also be some of his experiences of being in Michigan as well. Because even though it was outlawed, there was still slave hunters would come up to the north, and a lot of people just turn a blind eye to that. So it could be just his experiences of going around, the larger cities and into the United States. So I thought it was very interesting that when the deed that I had shown you, the deed I had showed you, Henry Washington, so the person of color that got the property, he purchased 15 acres on the north part of Lot 12 in Concession 4. And so this is the original homestead of Colonel King. He gave it to his son Alfred, and Henry Washington was a neighbor. So he had no problem, having a person of color being a neighboring farmer to his son. And also, prior to purchasing this farmland, Washington also owned and lived in town. He lived on a property on Mill Street West, just a few hundred yards away from Colonel King. So he was actually a neighbor of Colonel King as well, owned the land, and he was able to. And it even shows people giving Henry Washington mortgages as well. So I can't say much for Kingsville heading into the 20s, however, that's a whole nother talk, but I will say that early days here, it seemed very sympathetic. And I think it makes me feel a little bit better that Kingsville is named after such a man, kind of thing. We don't have to apologize for the name of our community anymore, or not anymore, but like perhaps other communities. Okay, so the 1850s proved to be a decade of growth for this new community, this new town of Kingsville that wasn't a town. The second post office to be established in Gosfield was named Kingsville, and that was issued, or established rather, in 1852. And the first town hall owned by the township of Gosfield was built in Kingsville. And then in 1852, St. John's Anglican Church was built on the north side of Main Street West. It went on to become Church of the Epiphany when they built the brick structure. And of St. John's Church, Colonel King was the first rector's warden of that church. By 1857, Colonel King and 2 different purchases, a couple years apart, purchased 2 lots on the south side of Mill Street West for a total of 9 acres, which we can see here in blue. And that was going to be Colonel King's new house. So he was no longer going to live north of, in town more. He was going to have a larger kind of estate. And that's when we get into the King's house, which is a beautiful house still we're lucky enough to still have. So this is a photo of King's home, which was completed in 1859 on the 9-acre lot on Mill Street West. It was built for Colonel King and his wife Sarah. The original structure was designed in the octagonal architectural style that was popular between 1850 and 1870. So we don't have any photos of what it looked like because wings were put on in the 1880s. But this is kind of a diagram that was put into a book. There's, people have studied octagonal houses during this time. And it's interesting to note that Kingsville has the only octagonal house from that era south of London. So north of London, there seems to be quite a bit. Into the States, there's quite a bit. But we have the only one in this area. And this gives you an idea of kind of the breakup of it. Now, octagonal architecture has very interesting roots. Anyone know about phrenology? Phrenology is the science of reading the bumps and planes on people's heads. And so this right here is a bust that people would use, and you would hire phrenologists to come, and if you're looking for a wife, and before you decide to propose, you may get her head read. Likewise, you might do that for a future husband. Queen Victoria had a phrenologist actually do a report on her son Albert's, and the reports were not good. And it turned out that, he was not great. So it is kind of interesting. But so the popularity of this building style can be linked to the American phrenologist Orson Squire Fowler. He didn't invent phrenology. Phrenology had been around, it had a resurgence every few hundred years. I think Egypt had phrenology. But he's the one that really made it mainstream for a couple decades. So phrenology, as described in the Encyclopedia Britannica, is the study of the conformation of the skull as indicative of mental faculties and traits of character. So can't see too much, but so you'll have morality. Over the ear is an interesting one because it's kind of like interest in drinks, and then interest in food. So it really gets down into the details. If you get a chance, you should look one of these up because it is very interesting. And people believed it. So in 1853, Fowler, the phrenologist, he published a book called A Home for All. And this is the title page for it. This is from the 1854 version, and it's Home for All, the Gravel Wall, or Octagon Mode of Building. And it had chapters in this book of defects in the usual shapes of houses and superiority of the octagon form. So, Fowler also toured around the US giving lectures on phrenology and presumably selling his books. And it's interesting to see that in 1856, this is an ad of him being in Detroit. So with this being 1856, Colonel King started his house in late 1857. I wonder if perhaps, being a learned man, maybe he would go to Detroit, because going to Detroit was somewhat easy in the 1850s, and that would be where you would go. If maybe he might have attended this and picked up a book or somehow. So the reason why the octagon was the most perfect form was the circle, Fowler argued, but it was difficult to build polygonal structures. They were difficult to build, the round ones, so polygonal structures were therefore the next best. And of these, the octagon was the most efficient and practical. It permitted greater receptivity of sunlight and air. Yeah, it makes sense. It eliminated unsightly internal corners. And it reduced the distance between any 2 points of the house, thus eliminating much of the toil and drudgery of housework. I'm sure it worked. So that's, so this would be, very prestigious to have an octagonal house. This would be a learned man. This would be someone that would be up to date on the latest science. So it's very interesting that we do have this house. And it is beautiful, regardless. So now the home has had several additions attached, but originally it was the octagonal home. It had the open veranda that encircled the original octagonal residence. And it was here that Mr. King would take his exercise on a rainy day. 50 times around was the usual walk. So it was his indoor exercise. This is his own walking track. King's home is now home to the Estate of Health Holistic Wellness Center and Yoga Studio. And last year, the property received heritage designation from the Kingsville Town Council. And I did bring a copy of the designation report that has, some different types of information, plus a lot of photos of it. So feel free afterwards to come check out the book. So Colonel King died in 1880. His wife died a few years earlier, 1864. Not much is really known about Sarah. Unfortunately, her obituary is very slight. I'm sorry to say I don't know a lot about her. I'm hoping, to eventually uncover something. But when Colonel King died, his obituary read that he was an old and respected pioneer of the county of Essex, and he died when he was 77 years old. He was the first school teacher in this locality and filled the office of clerk of the township and was clerk of the division court for over 20 years, only resigning it for about 4 years ago. He was also collector of customs at Kingsville up until 1873. when he was succeeded by his son Sidney. He was also Justice of the Peace. And then it talks about his kids, which I'll go over just a little bit. But it says, deceased was possessed of considerable property, having a fine homestead in the village and several farms in the township. The funeral took place on Wednesday and was largely attended. Flags were at half-mast in the village on Tuesday and Wednesday. Now, I think I shared with you the fact that it's such a big story, Colonel King coming to Kingsville, that I didn't get a chance to really talk about the rest of his family. And the rest of his family is very interesting, so that will definitely have to be another talk, Kim. So perhaps I can come and share the children's stories, because it does get, it's pretty fascinating family stories. But just to kind of go over the two stepsons, Leonard and Alexander. Colonel King did end up, when he was dividing his property back in 1878, he did give property to his stepsons, so he encouraged them and he did sponsor them in business enterprises. And then we have James Jr. that lived in Kingsville. Helena King, she married Dr. Allworth, and she was a longtime resident of Kingsville. Alfred is very interesting because we don't know when he passed away, and he was into a lot of stuff. He just seemed like he was all over the place. He's a very interesting character that I'd love to tell you about sometime. And then Dr. Sidney A. King, I think he may have even surpassed his father as far as what he did for the town of Kingsville. He's a really incredible character himself. So that'll be for another time. I want to let you know that Colonel King, actually, to go back, this monument right here is behind Church of the Epiphany, which is on Main Street West, and this is the King family plot. So you can go there, and a lot of the King families are buried there. And we have, so this is a picture of Church of the Epiphany, and this is the memorial stained glass window that's dedicated to James and Sarah King. So this window, you can just, if you go a little bit up on the altar, you can actually see James King and then Sarah on one side. This is dedicated to them for all they did to the church. And then lastly, I want to end on one of my favorite anecdotes, which is King Street. So as you can see, the original 1850 plan just shows these being lots. And then he had owned like a whole big, all the way up to like number 4. And so once he moved down to Mill Street, they sold off the property where his house was, which is now where the post office is. And that, in 1883, became the new Kingsville Town Hall. So Town Hall was located there. And they moved the cottage on the south side of King Street. So they started, so the King Street was actually the driveway to Colonel King's barns and sheds in the back. So it was just kind of, it just kind of built into the scenery, probably got a lot of action. And then they decided to just make it go all the way through at some point. So they started selling property on the south side of King Street to James Sweet. And he built a couple houses there that are still, the 2 brick houses that are on King Street are still there. So on the deed, when Sweet bought these lots, was the properties were located on the unnamed road south of the old town hall. So that was the description of the property. So it was just kept like that. No one bothered, naming it or anything. April 1911 comes by, and it's the Census of Canada. And in that Census of Canada, you have to list what road you live on. And so this, unnamed road south of the old town hall, too long for the census record. So James Sweet took it upon himself to name it St. James Street. So that happened in April. Well, someone must have got wind of it, because all of a sudden by November, town council's like, no, we name our streets, and we're naming it after King, because this is, the founder of Kingsville, this was the drive area for him, and we don't want St. James, because this is not a Catholic town, we don't want a saint, we don't have any streets here that are named saints. And so they renamed it King Street. So that's why poor Colonel King gets this tiny little itty bitty street, because it just goes from Division to Chestnut. But that was in response, and it took until 1911 to get a street named after Colonel King. And that's what I know about Colonel King.